The campsite was quiet except for the crackling of the fire. The flames cast flickering shadows on the surrounding trees, their shapes shifting like ghostly figures in the dark. It was my third year as a park ranger at Deep Hollow Reserve, and night patrols had become second nature. But there was something about this particular area, a small clearing near Wolf Pine Ridge, that always set me on edge. Maybe it was the isolation or the eerie way the wind seemed to whisper through the trees, but every time I came out here I felt watched. The family camping at the site was supposed to be out by noon, but their car was still parked at the trailhead when I checked that evening. Regulations were clear. No overnight camping without a permit. I grabbed my flashlight, radio, and clipboard and headed down the trail to investigate. The air was cooler than usual, and the usual forest sounds, chirping crickets, rustling leaves, seemed subdued. When I arrived at the clearing, the fire was still burning, though no one was sitting around it. A single tent stood on the far side of the site, zipped shut. I called out, announcing myself as a park ranger, but there was no response. My boots crunched on the gravel as I approached the fire, the warmth a stark contrast to the chilly air around me. Something about the scene felt off. The chairs around the fire were empty, and a half-finished cup of coffee sat on a nearby stump, still steaming. "Hello," I called again, louder this time. "Is anyone here?" The tent remained still. I moved closer, shining my flashlight on its nylon surface. I was about to unzip it when a sound stopped me cold. It was faint but distinct, a low, guttural growl coming from the trees behind me. I turned, the beam of my flashlight sweeping over the dark forest. Nothing moved, but the feeling of being watched crept over me like a shiver. "Anyone out there?" My voice sounded too loud in the quiet. The growl came again, this time closer. It wasn't a bear or a coyote. The sound was deeper, almost resonant, like it came from something much larger. My hand instinctively went to the radio at my belt, but before I could call it in, I saw them. Eyes. Two glowing orbs stared at me from the darkness, just beyond the reach of the firelight. They weren't the yellow eyes of an animal reflecting the fire's glow. They were something else entirely. They seemed to emit their own faint, unnatural light, and they didn't blink. My heart raced as I stood frozen, the flashlight shaking in my hand. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. The eyes didn't move, didn't flinch, but I could feel their focus, sharp and unrelenting. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, they were gone, swallowed by the darkness. I backed away from the tent, my instincts screaming at me to leave. But then the growling started again, joined by the sound of branches snapping in the distance. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer, as if something was circling the clearing. My flashlight darted from tree to tree, but the beam revealed nothing but swaying branches and empty forest. The fire sputtered, its flames shrinking as if something had sucked the air out of the clearing. The shadows around me deepened, stretching toward the tent like grasping hands. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as the feeling of being surrounded grew stronger. The whispers started then, faint and indecipherable, like dozens of voices speaking at once. They seemed to come from everywhere, weaving through the trees and wrapping around me. I turned and ran. The trail was barely visible in the dark, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I sprinted. The whispers followed, growing louder, and every so often, I caught glimpses of those glowing eyes in my periphery. They moved with unnatural speed, darting between the trees, always just out of reach. My lungs burned, and my legs ached, but I didn't stop until I saw the faint glow of the ranger station's porch light through the trees. Bursting through the door, I slammed it shut behind me and locked it, my hands trembling. My fellow ranger Jackson looked up from his desk, startled by my sudden entrance. "What the hell happened to you?" he asked, his face a mix of concern and confusion. "There's something out there," I gasped, struggling to catch my breath. "The campsite, Wolf Pine Ridge, there's something watching." Jackson grabbed his radio, but I stopped him. "Don't go out there," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Not tonight." The official report stated that the family had left the site hours earlier, leaving the fire unattended. A simple oversight. But I knew the truth. Whatever was out there wasn't human, and it wasn't done watching. Since that night, I've avoided Wolf Pine Ridge. I don't take assignments that lead me anywhere near it, and I warn campers to stay away. The forest is vast, ancient, and full of secrets, but some of those secrets aren't meant to be uncovered, and some eyes are better left unseen. The sun was dipping low on the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the forest. My shift as a park ranger was winding down, and I was preparing to close the east gate near Wolf Hollow Trail. The name came from local legends about wolves that once roamed the area, but no one had reported seeing one in decades. The trail was quiet, the air still, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves in the light breeze. As I locked the gate, I heard it, a low, mournful howl echoing through the trees. It stopped me in my tracks. The sound wasn't like anything I'd heard before. It wasn't the sharp yip of a coyote or the deep bark of a dog. This was different, haunting, almost human in its sorrow. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I scanned the forest, but the trees stood still and silent, betraying nothing. I radioed the station, asking if any nearby rangers had reported unusual activity. The reply crackled back. Nothing on our end. Probably just the wind. But it wasn't the wind. I knew that much. As the howl came again, closer this time, I felt an uneasy pull. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and ventured down the trail. My boots crunched on the gravel path, the sound unnaturally loud in the growing silence. The forest around me darkened with every step, the last rays of sunlight fading into twilight. I kept walking, following the sound that seemed to beckon me deeper. About a mile in, I came to a clearing. The remains of an old fire pit sat in the center, surrounded by scattered rocks and logs. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, yet the ground around it was freshly disturbed. As I moved closer, my flashlight caught something glinting in the dirt. Kneeling, I picked it up, a rusted dog tag, its surface scratched and worn. The name Luther was barely legible. I stood, my pulse quickening. The howl echoed again, louder now, resonating through the clearing. It sounded close, too close. I swept the beam of my flashlight across the trees, my heart pounding in my chest. Then I saw them. Eyes, faintly glowing, reflecting the light. They were low to the ground like those of an animal, but there was an intelligence in them that sent a shiver down my spine. The figure stepped out from the shadows and I felt my stomach drop. It looked like a wolf, but wrong. Its body was gaunt, its fur matted and patchy. Its limbs were too long, its joints bent at unnatural angles. And its face was almost human. I stumbled back, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The creature tilted its head as if studying me, and let out a guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the air. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. The creature took a step forward, and I finally snapped out of my paralysis, turning and bolting back toward the trail. The forest seemed to close in around me as I ran, branches clawing at my uniform and underbrush snagging at my boots. The creature's howls followed me, guttural and angry, growing louder with every step. I didn't dare look back, the sheer weight of its presence pressing against me like a physical force. The trail stretched endlessly before me, the light of the east gate nowhere in sight. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I could hear the creature's heavy footsteps gaining ground. My flashlight flickered, the beam dimming just as I thought I saw the faint glow of the gate ahead. With one final burst of adrenaline, I pushed myself forward, bursting out of the tree line and into the open. The gate was just ahead, the safety of my truck waiting beyond it. I risked a glance over my shoulder, but the trail behind me was empty. The howls had stopped. I didn't slow down until I reached my truck, slamming the door shut and locking it with shaking hands. My flashlight clattered onto the passenger seat as I fumbled to start the engine. The truck roared to life and I drove off, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. But the forest behind me was silent, the only movement the gentle sway of the trees in the wind. When I got back to the station, I handed over the dog tag to my supervisor and tried to explain what had happened. He listened, his expression unreadable, before finally saying, "Wolf Hollow has a history. Best to stay clear of it after dark." That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the creature haunted me. Its glowing eyes and twisted form burned into my memory. I never went back to Wolf Hollow Trail, not even during the day. Whatever I had encountered out there wasn't just an animal. It was something older, something that didn't belong in this world, and I knew it was still out there, waiting for the next unlucky soul to follow its mournful howl. The forest was dense and ancient, its towering pines shrouded in mist even during the brightest of days. As a park ranger assigned to the remote northern sector of Clearwater National Park, I often ventured into areas rarely touched by human presence. It was on one of these patrols that I first heard about the graveyard. Locals referred to it in hushed tones, claiming it was a forgotten burial site hidden deep in the forest. Some said it was from a small logging settlement that had been abandoned decades ago. Others whispered that it was far older than that. Official maps showed no such site, and most of my colleagues dismissed the stories as folklore. But when a hiker went missing near Pine Hollow, a particularly remote part of the park, my supervisor sent me to investigate. The graveyard was mentioned as a possible landmark the hiker might have encountered. I set out early, my gear packed for a long trek. The trail to Pine Hollow was narrow and overgrown, winding through miles of untouched wilderness. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became, as if even the animals avoided this part of the park. My radio crackled faintly as I checked in with the station, but the signal was weak this far out. By late afternoon, I reached the hollow. The air was cooler here, the ground soft and damp beneath my boots. I searched for signs of the missing hiker. Footprints, broken branches, anything, but found nothing. Just as I was about to call it in, my foot struck something hard and hollow. Looking down, I saw a piece of weathered wood protruding from the earth. Curious, I knelt to clear away the leaves and soil. What I uncovered made my breath catch. A simple wooden marker, its surface etched with faint carvings. Though worn and nearly illegible, I could make out a name and a date, 1876. The stories were true. I scanned the area and quickly spotted more markers, some barely visible through the thick undergrowth. There were dozens of them, arranged in uneven rows. Many had fallen over or rotted away, but a few still stood upright, their inscriptions faded by time. The atmosphere was heavy, the air thick with a strange metallic tang. The forest around me seemed to darken, the trees casting long, unnatural shadows. As I moved among the graves, I noticed something unsettling. The ground between the markers was disturbed, as if it had been dug up and filled in again recently. My gut tightened as I crouched to examine one of the mounds. The soil was loose, and faint traces of claw marks were etched into the dirt. They weren't the marks of an animal. These were long, deep, and deliberate. A sudden noise made me freeze. It was faint, like the rustling of leaves, but there was no wind. Slowly I turned, shining my flashlight into the trees. The beam caught movement, a shadow slipping between the trunks, too large to be a deer but too quick to make out clearly. My pulse quickened as I scanned the darkness, my hand instinctively going to my radio. "This is Ranger Cole," I said, my voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. "I've located a graveyard in Pine Hollow. There's something moving out here. Requesting backup." Static was my only reply. The signal was gone. The rustling grew louder, accompanied by a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human. The shadows seemed to shift and writhe, drawing closer. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw a face. A pale, hollow visage with empty eyes staring back at me from the edge of the clearing. Panic surged, and I backed away, nearly tripping over one of the graves. The guttural sound turned into a low moan, echoing through the hollow like a mournful wail. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The forest was silent again, but the oppressive feeling remained, pressing down on me like a weight. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. Gripping my flashlight tightly, I turned and made my way back to the trail as quickly as I could without breaking into a full sprint. The feeling of being watched followed me the entire way, the shadows at the edge of my vision seeming to move with a life of their own. When I finally reached the main trail, the air felt lighter, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as if I had crossed some invisible boundary. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. The drive back to the station was a blur. The image of that pale face burned into my mind. I filed my report, leaving out the more inexplicable details. The search team found no trace of the missing hiker, but when they reached the graveyard, They reported the same disturbed ground and claw marks I had seen. No one could explain it. To this day, I avoid Pine Hollow. The graveyard remains unmarked on official maps, and few dare venture near it. Whatever lies buried there, or whatever has risen, belongs to the forest now, and it's best left undisturbed. The morning was crisp, the kind of day that made me appreciate the isolation of my post at Blackstone Reserve. It wasn't a park that drew big crowds. Its beauty was rugged, untamed, and only the most dedicated hikers ventured this far. Most days were quiet, the trails empty except for the occasional wildlife sighting. But that day started with a call that would haunt me for the rest of my life. A group of campers had come across strange markings carved into the surface of Blackstone Rock, a massive, jagged formation that jutted out from the forest floor near the park's center. Blackstone Rock was known for its imposing size and eerie presence, but it had no history of vandalism. The campers sounded uneasy, describing the markings as intricate symbols they couldn't make sense of. They left the site quickly, unnerved, and asked if a ranger could investigate. I was curious. Blackstone Rock was ancient, its surface weathered and cracked, untouched for centuries. Vandals defacing such a revered natural landmark seemed unlikely. I set out on the trail leading to the site, the midday sun filtering through the canopy above. The forest was unusually quiet, no birds or rustling leaves to accompany me. It felt as though the park itself was holding its breath. When I arrived, the rock loomed before me, its dark surface glinting faintly in the sunlight. It was massive, a natural monolith surrounded by dense trees. From a distance, it appeared untouched just as it always had. But as I approached, I saw them, the markings. Carved deep into the stone, the symbols were unlike anything I'd seen before. They weren't random scratches or graffiti. They were precise, deliberate, and arranged in a circular pattern. Each symbol was unique, resembling ancient runes or hieroglyphs, though none I recognized. Some were jagged, others smooth, and they seemed to flow into each other as if telling a story. I ran my fingers over the carvings, the grooves cold and sharp against my skin. Whoever had done this had taken their time, and the precision was unnerving. The symbols didn't look new. The edges of the carvings were weathered, as though they had been there for decades, maybe longer. But I knew they hadn't been there a week ago when I last patrolled this area. I took out my phone to document the markings, snapping several photos from different angles. As I worked, a faint hum reached my ears. At first, I thought it was the wind whistling through the trees, but it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't wind. It was a low, rhythmic sound, almost like chanting. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I spun around, scanning the forest, but saw nothing. The chanting seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere surrounding me. I called out, my voice trembling slightly, "Is someone there?" The chanting stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. My heart pounded as I took a cautious step back from the rock. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The shadows cast by the trees around Blackstone Rock weren't right. They stretched unnaturally, bending in ways that defied the position of the sun. They seemed to converge toward the rock, like tendrils reaching for it. I stumbled back further, my flashlight now in hand despite the daylight. The shadows seemed to move, writhing against the ground, though there was no breeze to stir them. My radio crackled to life, but the voice on the other end was garbled, the words lost in static. Then, through the interference, I heard my name. It wasn't the voice of my supervisor or any ranger I knew. It was deep, guttural, and inhuman. My name echoed again, louder this time, and the shadows began to shift toward me. I turned and ran, my boots slipping on the loose dirt of the trail. The forest felt alive, the trees closing in as I sprinted away. The chanting returned, louder and more frantic, as though whatever was in the forest was following me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I reached the main trail, the sound of the chanting fading as I put more distance between myself and the rock. By the time I reached the ranger station, I was drenched in sweat, my hands shaking as I tried to explain what had happened. I showed the photos to my supervisor, but the symbols weren't clear. The images were distorted, the markings blurred as though something had corrupted the files. A team was sent to investigate Blackstone Rock the next day, but when they returned, they reported nothing unusual. The symbols were gone. the surface of the rock untouched. To this day, I don't know what I encountered at Blackstone Rock. I've read about ancient carvings and the power they can hold, but this felt different, malignant, alive. I've never returned to that part of the park, and I make a point to steer visitors away from it. Whatever those markings were, they weren't meant to be found, and I fear that by seeing them, I've awakened something that should have remained dormant. The story of Ranger Luke Harper was a cautionary tale told in hushed voices around campfires. He had been one of the best among us, sharp, experienced, and fearless. Luke knew the forest like the back of his hand, navigating its winding trails and dense undergrowth with ease. But one fateful night, he ventured into the western quadrant of the park and was never seen again. It had been a routine call, or so we thought at the time. A hiker reported strange noises near a trail known as Widow's Path, a secluded stretch infamous for its eerie reputation. Locals claimed it was haunted, though the stories varied. Some said it was the site of a forgotten tragedy, while others spoke of shadowy figures that appeared and vanished without a trace. Luke dismissed such tales, believing them to be nothing more than folklore. He set out just before sunset, armed with his flashlight, radio, and notebook. His last words over the radio were, "This is Harper heading into Widow's Path. Shouldn't take more than an hour." But the hours stretched into 2, then 3. When he failed to check in, we grew concerned and tried to contact him. Static was the only response. A search party was organized at dawn, and we combed the area tirelessly for days. All we found were his notebook and flashlight, both lying at the edge of a small clearing deep in the woods. The notebook's pages were damp and smeared, but one phrase was legible, written over and over. "It's watching me." That was 2 years ago. The search was officially called off, and Luke's disappearance became another unsolved mystery. But I couldn't let it go. Luke had been my friend, and the thought of him vanishing without explanation haunted me. So when I was assigned to Widow's Path last month, I saw it as an opportunity to find answers. I set out at dusk, much like Luke had. The forest was unnaturally still, the usual chorus of insects and birds absent. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the air felt, heavy with an almost electric charge. My flashlight beam seemed weaker than usual, as if the darkness was swallowing it. I reached the clearing where Luke's belongings had been found. The grass was overgrown now, the area seemingly untouched since the last search. I stood in the middle, turning slowly, my flashlight sweeping over the surrounding trees. They loomed tall and menacing, their branches intertwining like skeletal hands. "Luke?" I called out, my voice wavering slightly. "If you're out here, give me a sign." The forest remained silent, but then faintly, I heard it, a whisper. It was so soft I thought I'd imagined it, but then it came again, clearer this time. It sounded like my name, drawn out and breathy, carried on the wind. I spun around, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam caught movement between the trees, a shadow darting just out of view. My heart pounded as I stepped closer, calling out again. "Luke? Is that you?" The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices now, all unintelligible but insistent. I backed away toward the clearing, my instincts screaming at me to leave. But then I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the shadows. "Luke?" I whispered, though I already knew it wasn't him. The figure was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilted at an odd angle. Its eyes, if they could be called that, glowed faintly in the dark, fixed directly on me. It took a step forward, and the whispers exploded into a deafening roar. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering as the figure advanced. It didn't walk. It glided, its movements smooth and unnatural. My hand fumbled for the radio on my belt, but when I tried to call for help, the static was so loud it made me wince. The figure stopped just short of the clearing's center, its head tilting again as if studying me. Then it spoke. Not with words, but with a voice that echoed inside my head. "Why are you here?" "I'm looking for Luke," I managed to say, my voice shaking. "What happened to him?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised an impossibly long arm and pointed toward the trees. I turned to look, and for a brief moment I saw him. Luke. He was standing in the shadows, his face pale and his eyes hollow. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. When I looked back at the figure, it was gone. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I turned back to where Luke had been, but he was gone too. My flashlight flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging me into darkness. I ran. I don't remember how I found the trail or how I made it back to the station, but when I stumbled through the door, my colleagues stared at me like I'd seen a ghost. I didn't tell them what I'd seen, not fully. They wouldn't believe me anyway. I haven't been back to Widow's Path since, and I don't plan to. Whatever is in those woods took Luke, and it nearly took me too. Some places are meant to remain untouched, their secrets buried deep, but I can still hear the whispers when I close my eyes, and I know I'll never truly escape them. I had been stationed at the secluded Lakeview National Park for just over 6 months when I first met Paul, my only neighbor. The park housing was remote, with cabins scattered far apart for privacy, and Paul's cabin was the only one within a mile of mine. He was a quiet man, middle-aged, and seemed friendly enough when we occasionally crossed paths. He'd nod or give a short wave, but he never stopped to chat. It suited me fine. I wasn't much for small talk. One late afternoon, I was on my porch drinking coffee when I saw Paul walking toward the tree line behind his cabin, carrying a shovel over his shoulder. It wasn't unusual for rangers to clear small paths or plant markers, but something about his posture struck me as strange. He walked stiffly, his movements tense, almost robotic. I watched as he disappeared into the woods, the shovel glinting in the fading sunlight. The next morning, I noticed something odd. There was a freshly dug patch of dirt about 50 yards behind his cabin, just visible through the thinning trees. It was a long, rectangular mound, and it looked out of place in the otherwise untouched forest floor. Curiosity got the better of me, and during my patrol I veered toward Paul's property to get a closer look. I told myself it was part of my job, to ensure no unauthorized digging or disturbances to the park's ecosystem. When I reached the mound, I stopped cold. It wasn't just a pile of dirt. It was a grave. The dimensions were unmistakable, and the earth had been packed down carefully, almost meticulously. My stomach tightened as I scanned the area, half expecting to find something or someone out of place. But there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the forest. I decided to pay Paul a visit. As I walked up to his cabin, I rehearsed how I'd bring it up without accusing him of anything. When he opened the door, he looked startled, his eyes darting briefly to the woods before settling on me. "Hey, Paul," I said, trying to sound casual. "I noticed you've been doing some digging out back. Everything all right?" His lips twitched into a strained smile. "Oh, yeah. Just clearing some space. Thought I'd plant a garden next spring." The explanation was reasonable enough, but his tone was off. Too hurried. Too rehearsed. I nodded, not wanting to push him too far. "All right. Just let me know if you need any help with it. Regulations can be tricky in protected areas." He thanked me, his gaze lingering on me as I walked away. It felt like he was waiting for me to leave, as if I'd interrupted something. That night I couldn't sleep. The image of the grave kept flashing in my mind, and Paul's uneasy demeanor didn't help. Around midnight, I stepped out onto my porch for some fresh air. The forest was quiet, the kind of silence that amplifies every small sound. Then I heard it, a faint scraping noise, like metal against earth. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the noise, my pulse quickening with every step. The sound led me back to the same spot behind Paul's cabin, where I found him crouched over the grave. He was shoveling dirt into it, muttering under his breath. His movements were frantic, and the beam of my flashlight caught the sweat glistening on his face. "Paul!" I called out, my voice louder than I intended. He froze, his head snapping toward me. For a moment, his eyes were wild, almost feral, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "What are you doing out here?" I demanded, keeping the flashlight trained on him. He straightened slowly, the shovel still in his hands. "It's none of your business," he said, his voice low and trembling. "You shouldn't be here." My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't. "Paul, if there's something going on, you need to tell me. I can help." He let out a bitter laugh. "You can't help. No one can. It's too late. Before I could respond, he suddenly dropped the shovel and bolted into the woods. I called after him, but he didn't look back. Torn between following him and investigating the grave, I decided to see what he'd been burying, or uncovering. I picked up the shovel and began digging. The dirt was loose, and it didn't take long to reach something solid. My flashlight illuminated what looked like a large burlap sack, tightly bound with twine. My hands trembled as I pulled it out of the earth and opened it. Inside were bones. Animal bones, bleached white and broken. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I stood there, trying to make sense of it, I noticed symbols carved into the surrounding trees, crude and jagged. They looked ancient, like something out of a ritual. Suddenly, the forest came alive with noise, branches snapping, whispers echoing all around me. The air grew colder, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the woods themselves were watching me. I dropped the shovel and ran, not stopping until I was back inside my cabin, locking the door behind me. Paul never returned. His cabin was left abandoned, and the grave behind it was filled in by the time a search team arrived. The bones and symbols were gone, leaving no evidence of what I had seen. I was told to forget about it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something far older and darker than us lives in those woods, waiting for the right moment to wake. Widow's Peak was a place we rarely ventured, even as park rangers. Officially, it was part of the park's protected wilderness, a remote area that hadn't seen regular foot traffic in years. The terrain was treacherous, with jagged cliffs and dense underbrush, but that wasn't why we avoided it. The stories kept people away, tales of hikers who vanished without a trace, strange lights seen dancing on the cliffs, and whispers carried on the wind that didn't belong to any living creature. Locals called it Widow's Peak because it was said to be cursed, a place where those who entered were never the same when, or if, they came back. I had my doubts about the stories, chalking them up to local superstition. But one late summer evening, I found myself assigned to investigate a report of unusual activity near the area. A group of campers had been hiking the trails nearby when they claimed to hear voices calling out from the direction of the peak. They described them as desperate, pleading voices, but when they tried to investigate, they found nothing. They were shaken enough to pack up and leave early, and the call landed on my desk. The trail to Widow's Peak was overgrown and unmarked, winding through thick forest before climbing steeply toward the cliffs. The closer I got, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The usual sounds of the forest faded until all I could hear was the crunch of my boots on the rocky path and the occasional rustle of leaves. The air grew colder, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones no matter how warm the day had been. I reached the base of the cliffs just as the sun was setting. The last rays of light bathed the jagged rocks in a blood-red glow, making them seem almost alive. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint sound that made me pause. It wasn't the rustling of leaves or the distant call of a bird. It was a voice, faint and far off but unmistakable. "Help, please." My breath caught. It sounded human but strained, as though the speaker were weak or injured. "This is Ranger Holt," I called out, my voice echoing off the cliffs. "If you can hear me, call back." The reply was faint, almost drowned out by the wind. "Over here." I followed the sound, climbing the uneven path that led to the top of the peak. The higher I went, the more uneasy I felt. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, and the air felt heavier, as if I were walking through water. The voice grew louder, clearer, but still carried that strange, desperate edge. When I reached the summit, the voice stopped abruptly, leaving me in silence. I shined my flashlight around, illuminating the rocky ground and sparse vegetation. At first, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Then my beam landed on something that made my stomach turn. It was a pile of clothing, old, weathered, and covered in dirt. Nearby, I found a rusted hiking pole and a torn backpack, both of which looked like they'd been there for years. My radio crackled to life, startling me. "Holt, do you copy?" came the dispatcher's voice. "We're losing your signal." I grabbed the radio, my hands trembling. "I'm at Widow's Peak," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I've found what looks like abandoned gear. No sign of anyone here." Before the dispatcher could respond, the radio cut out, replaced by static. I cursed under my breath, the oppressive silence around me growing louder. And then I heard it again. The voice. Help me. It was closer now, coming from the edge of the cliff. I approached cautiously, shining my flashlight down. My breath caught in my throat. A figure was clinging to the rock face, its hands gripping the jagged edge. But something about it wasn't right. The hands were pale and skeletal, the fingers too long. And as it turned its face toward me, I felt my blood run cold.